one man, an entire empire, and a war that refused to end, East Africa's endless war, Lettow-Vorbeck versus the Empire. While the trenches of Europe fell silent, one German commander kept fighting, alone. Unstoppable, impossible to defeat. This is the story they almost forgot. Subscribe for more forgotten wars that changed everything. While Europe's armies ground themselves into senseless slaughter across the Western Front, a different kind of war was unfolding thousands of miles away in the African bush. On August 3, 1914, as the great powers mobilized their millions, General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck took command of German East Africa with fewer than 3,000 soldiers. What followed would become one of history's most remarkable military campaigns, and one of its most devastating. Lettow-Vorbeck understood something his European counterparts had forgotten. Warfare need not follow the rules of the trenches. When British forces arrived to crush the German colony, he met them at the Battle of Tanga on November 3rd through 5th, 1914, and delivered a humiliating defeat that stunned the empire. But this was merely the beginning. For the next 4 years, Lettow-Vorbeck orchestrated a masterclass in guerrilla warfare, refusing to surrender even as the war in Europe ended. He kept fighting until November 25, 1918, 2 weeks after the Armistice. Yet his campaign carried a terrible cost, invisible to the world's attention. Millions of African civilians starved as his army requisitioned food, conscripted porters, and devastated the landscape in pursuit of survival. This is the story of a general who achieved tactical brilliance while presiding over humanitarian catastrophe, of an empire stretched to its limits, chasing an opponent who would not accept defeat, and of ordinary Africans caught between empires fighting a war not their own. The declaration came not as a thunderclap, but as an inevitable consequence of diplomatic failure. When Britain issued its ultimatum to Germany on the 4th of August 1914, the ripples extended far beyond the trenches of France and Belgium. In the colonial territories of East Africa, where German and British spheres of influence had long existed in an uneasy coexistence, the machinery of imperial warfare began to turn. The question was not whether conflict would come to this distant frontier, but how quickly it would arrive and what form it would take. Colonel Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck stood at the center of this storm. A Prussian officer of considerable tactical acumen, he commanded the Schutztruppe, the German colonial force in German East Africa, a territory roughly equivalent in size to the modern nations of Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi combined. When war was declared, Lettow-Vorbeck possessed approximately 5,000 soldiers under his command, a mixture of German officers and non-commissioned officers, alongside approximately 13,000 African Askaris, indigenous troops whose loyalty and combat capabilities would prove crucial to the campaigns ahead. The numerical disadvantage was stark, but the terrain offered possibilities that no European battlefield could match. The British response to the German threat in East Africa was characteristically methodical, yet ultimately underestimated the challenge before them. The Crown possessed vastly superior resources in the region, more troops, more ships, more industrial capacity. Yet, these advantages meant little in the vast, disease-ridden expanses of African bush and mountain. The British Indian Army was mobilized. Colonial forces from South Africa and Rhodesia were called to arms. Belgian forces in the Congo prepared for operations along shared borders. The machinery of imperial coordination, for all its complexity, began to assemble. Lettow-Vorbeck, however, harbored no illusions about defeating the British Empire in any conventional sense. His strategic vision was fundamentally different. Rather than seek a decisive battle that his forces could not possibly win, he conceived of a campaign of maneuver and attrition. He would make the British pay for every mile of territory, every engagement, every objective. He would stretch their supply lines across impossible distances. He would keep his forces in the field intact and fighting for as long as the war in Europe continued. This was not the strategy of a man seeking victory, but of a commander determined to impose costs that Britain could ill afford to pay while simultaneously maintaining a German presence in Africa. The opening moves came swiftly. On the 3rd of August 1914, even as formal declarations of war were still being processed through official channels, German forces struck at British installations. The wireless station at Dar es Salaam was seized and destroyed. German vessels attempted to break out of colonial waters into the Indian Ocean. The Königsberg, a German light cruiser, would spend the coming months raiding Allied shipping before eventually being tracked down and destroyed by British forces on the 1st of July 1915, but not before inflicting considerable damage on commercial traffic. Yet it was the Battle of Tanga, fought during the 3rd through 5th of November 1914, that set the tone for the entire campaign. The British, confident in their superiority, launched an amphibious assault on the coastal town of Tanga, intending a swift capture and a demonstration of Imperial dominance. What they encountered instead was a force of German defenders, smaller in number but expertly positioned and led with tactical brilliance. The British forces, landing on beaches and attempting to establish a foothold, were met with disciplined rifle fire and counterattacks. What should have been a straightforward victory became a stalemate, then a British withdrawal. The psychological impact of Tanga reverberated through both camps. For the British, it was an unexpected setback, a reminder that African theatres of war could not be treated as secondary sideshows. For Lettow-Vorbeck and his forces, it was validation that they could stand against the might of the British Empire and prevail through superior tactics and determination. The Germans had inflicted approximately 400 casualties on the British force while suffering far fewer themselves. More importantly, they had prevented the rapid conquest of German East Africa that British planners had anticipated. The terrain itself became a character in this unfolding drama. The landscape of German East Africa was not conducive to conventional warfare. Mountains, dense forests, vast plains and rivers created a patchwork of distinct operational zones. The climate was brutally punishing. Malaria, dysentery, and sleeping sickness killed far more soldiers than enemy bullets ever would. The supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of territory where infrastructure was minimal and communications fragile. For an army attempting to conquer and occupy territory, these challenges were nearly insurmountable. For an army seeking to remain mobile, to strike and withdraw, to exhaust an opponent through constant harassment, these same challenges became opportunities. Lettow-Vorbeck understood this landscape intimately. He had served in German East Africa for years prior to the war, and he had spent considerable time studying the terrain and understanding its possibilities. His Askari forces, drawn from local populations, knew the land as their home. They moved through bush and forest with practiced ease. They understood the water sources, the seasonal patterns, the hiding places. They were not occupiers but natives of this territory, fighting to preserve German authority in their homeland. The British, by contrast, were still learning. Their forces were largely composed of Indian soldiers, South African volunteers, and British regulars unaccustomed to African warfare. They brought with them the doctrines and assumptions of European warfare. Expecting decisive battles fought in relatively open terrain, they had not yet fully grasped that Lettow-Vorbeck had no intention of offering them the kind of battle they expected. As 1914 drew to a close and 1915 began, the contours of the campaign were becoming clear. This would not be a war of rapid conquest. This would be a grinding, exhausting struggle across a vast territory where disease and distance were as formidable as any enemy force. The casualty figures would eventually tell a story of staggering human cost. The British Empire would suffer approximately 3,443 killed in action, with over 6,500 more dying of disease. The African porters and carriers supporting both sides would suffer even more catastrophically, with estimates suggesting around 100,000 deaths from starvation, disease, and war-related causes. These numbers were still in the future, but the conditions that would produce them were already taking shape in the African bush. The war that had begun with such certainty in August of 1914 was not proceeding as the British Empire had anticipated. In Europe, the great armies had already begun their descent into the nightmare of trench warfare, where millions of men would be expended for the sake of yards of mud. But in German East Africa, a different calculus was emerging. General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck understood something fundamental about colonial warfare that many of his European counterparts had yet to grasp. Victory did not require the conquest of territory or the destruction of enemy forces in the conventional sense. Victory required the persistence of one's own forces and the consumption of the enemy's resources. By this measure, the German commander would prove to be a masterful strategist. When Lettow-Vorbeck assumed command of German East Africa's military forces, he inherited a position that appeared hopeless by any rational assessment. His Schutztruppe numbered approximately 5,000 men, a mixture of German officers and NCOs alongside African soldiers and porters. The British Empire, by contrast, could draw upon the vast resources of its global dominion. Yet the German general recognized that the very vastness of the theater and the difficulty of the terrain offered him advantages that no amount of numerical superiority could entirely overcome. The African bush, with its dense vegetation, treacherous climate, and vast distances, would become his greatest ally. The first major engagement of the campaign came on the 3rd of November in 1914, when British forces launched an amphibious assault on the coastal town of Tanga. The operation, intended to secure a strategic port and establish a base of operations, would instead become a humbling demonstration of Lettow-Vorbeck's tactical acumen. The British commander, Major General Arthur Aitken landed approximately 8,000 troops with the expectation of overwhelming the German garrison. What followed between the 3rd and 5th of November was a masterclass in mobile defense and psychological warfare. Lettow-Vorbeck deployed his forces with meticulous precision, using the town's geography to maximum advantage. His men, familiar with the terrain and accustomed to the climate, moved with an efficiency that the British troops, fresh from transport and disoriented by the tropical environment, could not match. The British forces, moreover, were plagued by confusion in their command structure and hampered by their unfamiliarity with the conditions of African warfare. After 2 days of intense fighting, with casualties mounting and supplies becoming precarious, General Aitken made the decision to withdraw. The British had suffered approximately 1,500 casualties, while German losses numbered only a few hundred. More significantly, the British had been forced to abandon substantial quantities of supplies and equipment, which Lettow-Vorbeck's men immediately repurposed for their own use. The victory at Tanga reverberated across the colonial theatre. German prestige soared, while British confidence suffered a significant blow. More importantly, the engagement established a pattern that would define the entire campaign. The Germans would avoid large-scale conventional battles, would strike at vulnerable points in British supply lines, and would then withdraw into the bush before overwhelming force could be brought to bear. This strategy would prove devastatingly effective in consuming British resources while preserving German fighting capacity. Yet the British possessed advantages that would gradually accumulate as the months turned into years. Naval superiority allowed them to control the coastal regions and gradually reduce German access to supplies from outside Africa. In July of 1915, the German cruiser Königsberg, which had been conducting commerce raiding in the Indian Ocean, was tracked down and sunk by British naval forces. This loss meant that German East Africa was now effectively cut off from external supply. Lettow-Vorbeck would henceforth need to live off the land and off the supplies he could capture from his enemies. The transition from conventional military operations to guerrilla warfare began in earnest in 1915. Lettow-Vorbeck reorganized his forces into smaller, more mobile units capable of operating independently across vast distances. The Schutztruppe, never a large force by European standards, became even more dispersed and difficult to pin down. The general understood that his role was not to defend territory, but to remain in the field, to continue to harass British operations, and to tie down ever-increasing numbers of British and Allied forces that might otherwise have been deployed to other theaters of war. This strategy had profound consequences for the people of East Africa. As conventional supply lines broke down and military operations spread across the entire region, the civilian population began to suffer catastrophically. The movement of armies, the destruction of crops, the requisition of livestock, and the general disruption of normal economic life created conditions of severe hardship. Porters and carriers, essential to any military operation in the African interior, were pressed into service in ever-increasing numbers. These men, often conscripted or coerced from their homes, faced disease, malnutrition, and exhaustion. Scholars estimate that approximately 100,000 African civilians and carriers perished during the course of the campaign, a toll that dwarfed the military casualties on all sides. These deaths resulted from starvation, disease, and the general chaos of warfare, though they are frequently overlooked in historical accounts that focus primarily on the military operations themselves. The British response to Lettow-Vorbeck's strategy was to commit increasingly large forces to the pursuit. By 1915, the British were deploying not only regular army units, but also forces from across the empire. Indian troops, South African forces, and troops from other British dominions were gradually committed to the East African theatre. The Belgian Congo, now that Belgium had entered the war on the side of the Entente, contributed forces as well. The Portuguese, who controlled Mozambique and had colonial interests adjacent to German East Africa, eventually entered the war in 1916 and committed their own military resources to the conflict. Despite this accumulation of forces, Lettow-Vorbeck remained elusive. He moved his forces through the vast interior, striking at isolated British outposts and supply depots, then disappearing into the bush before British columns could bring him to decisive battle. The British found themselves chasing a phantom army across impossible terrain. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles. Logistics became a nightmare, particularly as the Schutztruppe's harassment of British operations made it increasingly difficult to maintain the supply routes necessary to sustain large military forces in the African interior. The human cost of these operations mounted steadily. British casualties in East Africa eventually reached approximately 3,443 killed in action, with another 6,558 dying of disease. The Belgian forces suffered approximately 2,620 killed or died of disease, with an additional 15,650 porters perishing. The Portuguese lost approximately 5,533 soldiers killed, with another 5,640 missing or captured. These figures represent the military and European colonial casualties. The African component of these losses was far larger and far less precisely documented. German casualties, by contrast, remained relatively modest by the standards of the Great War. Approximately 2,000 German soldiers were killed or wounded during the entire campaign. This disparity in casualties reflected the fundamental strategic reality. Lettow-Vorbeck was not attempting to win battles in the conventional sense, but rather to survive and to continue to impose costs on his enemies. Each month that his forces remained in the field was a month in which the British had to commit resources to East Africa rather than to other theaters of war. Each engagement that could be avoided was a tactical victory because it meant that British forces were being consumed by the mere necessity of maintaining operations in an hostile environment. By 1916 and into 1917, the campaign had evolved into something that resembled less a conventional war and more a vast, grinding contest of attrition. The British gradually pushed German forces southward into increasingly difficult terrain. The Schutztruppers' numbers dwindled as men were killed, wounded, or incapacitated by disease. Yet Lettow-Vorbeck continued to operate, continued to strike at British positions, and continued to maintain the fiction that German East Africa remained an active theater of war. This persistence had strategic implications far beyond East Africa itself. The British commitment of forces to the region was substantial and growing. Resources that might have been deployed to other theaters, whether in Europe, the Middle East, or elsewhere, were instead committed to the pursuit of Lettow-Vorbeck's elusive army. The general strategy of strategic harassment was working precisely as he had calculated. He was tying down British forces and consuming British resources while maintaining the independence and fighting capacity of his own command. The crisis that defined Act II of this conflict was not a dramatic military engagement, but rather the gradual realization on both sides that this war would not be won or lost through conventional means. For the British, the crisis was the dawning comprehension that despite overwhelming numerical superiority and access to vastly greater resources, they were unable to bring Lettow-Vorbeck's forces to decisive battle or to eliminate the German threat to their control of East Africa. For Lettow-Vorbeck, the crisis was the recognition that while he could continue to resist, the cumulative pressure of British resources and the deteriorating situation in Europe meant that his campaign, however brilliantly executed, could not ultimately succeed in any conventional sense. What emerged from this turning point was a new understanding of what victory and defeat might mean in this distant theater of war. Lettow-Vorbeck would continue to fight not because he believed he could defeat the British, but because his continued resistance served strategic purposes for Germany, and because the pursuit of his forces consumed resources that might otherwise have been available for deployment elsewhere. The British, meanwhile, would continue to commit ever-increasing forces to the pursuit, because they could not tolerate the idea of German forces remaining active in territory they considered their own. The human cost of this grinding campaign would accumulate inexorably as the war continued into its final years. The porters and carriers who sustained military operations, the African civilians caught in the path of advancing armies, and the soldiers of all nations involved would continue to pay the price for a conflict that had begun in Europe, but whose consequences extended across the globe. By the end of 1917, the crisis had become clear. This war in East Africa would continue until one side or the other simply exhausted its capacity to continue, regardless of the magnitude of the human suffering involved. The turning point had been reached, and the terrible logic of attrition would now determine the course of the conflict. The year 1918 arrived in East Africa, not with the fanfare that greeted the Armistice in Europe, but with the grinding persistence of a man who refused to acknowledge defeat. While the guns fell silent along the Western Front on the 11th of November, General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck continued his campaign through the bush and highlands of German East Africa, seemingly oblivious to the collapse of the German Empire itself. His force had dwindled to perhaps 3,000 men, a shadow of the 12,000 troops he had commanded at the war's beginning. Yet still he moved, still he fought, still he demanded that the British Empire devote resources to his pursuit rather than to the occupied territories of Europe. The final phase of the campaign had become something altogether different from the conventional warfare of the early years. The destruction of the German cruiser Königsberg in July of 1915 had eliminated any possibility of naval support or reinforcement from Europe. The sinking of that vessel, achieved through a combination of British naval operations and the tireless efforts of Allied forces, had forced Lettow-Vorbeck to accept a fundamental reality. His colonial possession was now entirely cut off from the fatherland. Yet, rather than surrender, rather than accept the inevitable, he transformed his army into something the British had not anticipated. a ghost force that existed solely to consume British military resources and attention. By 1916, the British had committed over 100,000 troops to the East African theatre. These soldiers, drawn from across the British Empire and its allied territories, represented an enormous commitment of manpower and material at a time when every soldier was desperately needed in France. Lettow-Vorbeck understood this calculus perfectly. He could not win a conventional war against such overwhelming numbers. The mathematics of imperial power were simply too vast, but he could ensure that the British would never truly win either. He could keep them engaged, keep them bleeding resources, keep them unable to declare the campaign concluded. In this way, a general with a few thousand men held at bay an empire with hundreds of millions of subjects. The guerrilla phase of the war tested the limits of imperial logistics in ways that no commander in London had fully anticipated. Lettow-Vorbeck and his force moved through territories that the British considered pacified, striking at supply lines, raiding isolated garrisons, and then vanishing into the vast African landscape. The terrain itself became his ally: dense forests, swollen rivers during the rainy season, mountains that offered natural defensive positions. His men, hardened by years of campaigning and led by officers who understood both military science and the specific challenges of African warfare, became increasingly skilled at this form of combat. Yet the human cost of this prolonged struggle was staggering. The official casualty figures tell only part of the story. The British Empire would eventually record approximately 3,443 soldiers killed in action and 6,558 dead from disease. These numbers, while substantial, represented only the visible casualties among European troops. The Portuguese forces fighting in the southern regions suffered 5,533 killed and 5,640 missing or captured. The Belgian contingents contributed 2,620 deaths from combat and disease, with an additional 15,650 African porters perishing in their service. But beneath these military statistics lay a tragedy of truly catastrophic proportions. The African porters, carriers, and civilian populations caught in the war's path suffered losses that dwarfed the military casualties. Estimates suggest that approximately 100,000 African civilians and carriers died from starvation, disease, and war-related causes. These were not soldiers who had chosen to participate in a European conflict. They were men, women, and children conscripted or coerced into service, forced to carry supplies through disease-ridden regions, their labor essential to the functioning of any military campaign in the African interior. Many died of sleeping sickness, malaria, and dysentery. Many more starved when the campaigns disrupted agricultural patterns and destroyed the infrastructure of food distribution. The war in East Africa, for all its distance from European battlefields, was a war of conquest and occupation that exacted a terrible price from those who lived in the land being fought over. Lettow-Vorbeck himself remained curiously distant from this human tragedy. In his memoirs and official reports, he presented the campaign as a matter of military honor and professional obligation. He had been ordered to hold East Africa against the British, and he would hold it for as long as humanly possible. This was the duty of a Prussian officer, the responsibility that came with the commission he held. Yet, this narrow focus on military duty obscured the broader reality that his determination to continue fighting, admirable though it might appear from certain perspectives, meant the continuation of suffering for hundreds of thousands of African people who had no stake in the outcome of a European war. The British commanders facing him grew increasingly frustrated. General Jan Smuts, the South African general who assumed command of the British forces in 1916, brought with him a reputation for tactical brilliance and an understanding of campaign warfare in difficult terrain. Smuts pursued Lettow-Vorbeck with vigor, attempting to encircle and trap the German force to bring the campaign to a definitive conclusion. Yet even Smuts' considerable abilities could not pin down an opponent who understood the landscape so intimately and who maintained such strict discipline over his troops. The German general seemed to know every path, every water source, every defensible position. He moved his force like a living organism, flowing around obstacles, appearing where least expected, vanishing before encirclement could be completed. By 1917, the campaign had evolved into something almost surreal. Lettow-Vorbeck was fighting not for victory. He understood that was impossible, but for continuation. He fought to prove that Germany could maintain a military force in the field despite the vast superiority of British resources. He fought to demonstrate that the German army, even when isolated and cut off from support, remained a disciplined and formidable force. In a larger sense, He was fighting against the idea that the British Empire could simply brush aside German resistance anywhere on the globe. There was something almost philosophical about his determination to persist. The correspondence between British commanders during this period reveals a growing exasperation. Here was an enemy who refused to accept the rules of imperial warfare. Lettow-Vorbeck would not stand and fight decisive battles. He would not defend fixed positions. He would not surrender when surrounded or when his supply lines were cut. Instead, he fought a campaign of movement and dispersal, of constant marauding, of strategic harassment. This was not the warfare that British officers had been trained for, not the clear victory that could be reported to London as a successful conclusion of operations. The turning point came not from military defeat in the field, but from the collapse of the German Empire itself. When the armistice was signed on the 11th of November 1918, Lettow-Vorbeck was still in the field with his force intact. He had never been decisively defeated. His army had never been forced to surrender or disbanded through military catastrophe. Instead, the political structure that gave his command meaning and authority simply ceased to exist. Germany had surrendered. The Kaiser had abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. The German government was in chaos, its military structure collapsing as soldiers refused orders and mutinied against their officers. Lettow-Vorbeck received news of the armistice and the German collapse with what his officers described as stoic composure. He understood immediately what it meant. The government he served no longer existed. The cause for which he was fighting was lost. Yet even in this moment of supreme irony, to be undefeated in the field while his nation surrendered far away, he maintained his military bearing and his sense of duty. He negotiated the terms of his surrender to the British, insisting that his troops be treated as soldiers who had fought honorably, not as colonial rebels or brigands. On the 25th of November 1918, just 2 weeks after the armistice in Europe, Lettow-Vorbeck formally surrendered his remaining force to the British. He had maintained the campaign for over 4 years, with a force that never exceeded a fraction of the British strength arrayed against him. His men numbered perhaps 2,000 at the moment of surrender, having suffered approximately 2,000 casualties throughout the entire war. These losses seem almost negligible compared to the millions of casualties being counted on the Western Front, yet they represented the complete destruction of the German colonial military establishment in Africa. The British received his surrender with a respect that acknowledged the military skill and determination he had displayed. Lettow-Vorbeck was allowed to march his troops into captivity with their weapons, permitted a final parade that honored their service. This gesture, unusual for the time, reflected the recognition that Lettow-Vorbeck had fought a campaign that, while ultimately unsuccessful, had been conducted with professional competence and without the systematic brutality that characterized some other colonial conflicts. What followed was perhaps even more remarkable than the campaign itself. Lettow-Vorbeck returned to Germany, which was now a defeated nation struggling to come to terms with its humiliation and the loss of its colonial empire. He became a figure of some importance in post-war German politics and military circles. To many Germans, he represented the one commander who had not been defeated, who had held the line even when all others had collapsed. This reputation, however, obscured the more complex reality of his campaign, that his continued fighting, while militarily impressive, had prolonged immense suffering among civilian populations and had consumed resources that could not be replaced. The legacy of the East African campaign proved more complicated than either victory or defeat. For the British Empire, the campaign demonstrated the challenges of maintaining imperial control over vast territories with limited resources. The commitment of over 100,000 troops to hold East Africa seemed, in retrospect, an enormous investment for relatively little strategic gain. The territory itself had limited economic value, and the German threat, while persistent, was never genuinely existential. Yet the British felt compelled to commit these resources because allowing a German force to operate freely in African territory would have undermined the prestige of imperial power. For Germany, the loss of East Africa meant the complete elimination of German colonial presence in Africa. The Treaty of Versailles would formally transfer the territory to British administration under a League of Nations mandate. German colonialism in Africa, which had existed for only a few decades, was now definitively ended. Lettow-Vorbeck's campaign, for all its tactical successes, had not changed this outcome. Instead, it had simply prolonged the process and added to the human cost. The human cost remained the most profound legacy. The 100,000 African casualties, porters, carriers, and civilians, represented a tragedy that received relatively little attention in the histories written by Europeans focused on the military achievements of the campaign. These Africans had not volunteered for service in a European war. They had been conscripted or coerced into labor by both German and British forces. They had died in vast numbers from disease, malaria, sleeping sickness, and starvation. Their suffering had been a necessary precondition for the campaign to continue, yet their deaths were often recorded merely as statistics in casualty lists, if they were recorded at all. Lettow-Vorbeck himself lived until 1956, dying at the age of 87 in Germany. He spent his later years writing memoirs and giving speeches about his campaign. He was celebrated in some circles as a military genius, a man who had accomplished the impossible through determination and skill. Yet his campaign also served as a stark reminder of the costs of prolonged colonial warfare, of the way that military honor and duty could mask the suffering of those who had no voice in the decisions that affected their lives. The East African campaign ultimately demonstrated that even the vast power of the British Empire had limits. An opponent who refused to fight conventional battles, who understood the terrain intimately, and who maintained strict discipline over his forces could impose costs that were disproportionate to the resources he commanded. Yet this demonstration of British limitations came at a price that the African populations bore far more heavily than the imperial powers themselves. The campaign left territories devastated, populations decimated by disease and starvation, and social structures disrupted by years of warfare. History has accorded Lettow-Vorbeck the status of a skilled military commander who prolonged an impossible struggle through tactical brilliance and determination. This assessment is not entirely unfair. He did accomplish remarkable military feats with limited resources, yet history has been less attentive to the price paid for these accomplishments by the African populations whose lands became the battleground for a European conflict that had nothing to do with their own interests or desires. The East African campaign stands as a reminder that military achievement and human suffering are often inseparable, and that the stories of imperial power, when examined closely, reveal the tragic consequences borne by those with the least ability to resist. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed learning about this fascinating chapter of World War I history. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story. I'd love to hear what you think. Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts on this topic. What surprised you most? What would you like to explore next? There are so many incredible stories from the Great War waiting to be told, and I'm excited to share them with you in upcoming videos. Each one reveals something new about this transformative period in history. Thanks again for being here. Stay curious and keep learning. See you next time.